We move through life trusting our beliefs that the world is stable, that our choices make sense, that our deepest convictions rest on solid ground. David Hume invites us to pause and ask a quieter, more unsettling question before we talk about the world. How well do we understand the mind that is talking? Hume's path begins not with the universe or God, but with the simple fact of experience. He proposes a science of human nature, grounded in careful inward observation. Notice what actually appears in the mind. He says, the bright force of sensations and feelings, and the fainter afterglow of these in memory and imagination. Call the first impressions, the second ideas. From here comes his first deep insight. The mind does not create ideas from nothing. Every genuine idea is drawn, in some way, from an impression. Thought can combine, divide and rearrange, but it never steps entirely beyond what experience has given. Whenever we find an idea we cannot trace back to some lived impression, we should grow suspicious. Perhaps we are holding a word, not a true meaning. This becomes Hume's quiet discipline, a way of gently testing our most cherished concepts. His second insight concerns how our thoughts move. Certain ideas call up others by resemblance, by closeness in space and time, and most powerfully by cause and effect. We feel as though causes contain a necessary power binding the future to the past. Hume asks us to look more closely. All we ever see is one kind of event regularly followed by another. The sense of necessity arises not from the objects, but from us, from habit, from the mind's tendency to expect repetition. Custom more than pure reason carries us from what we have seen to what we believe will come. A third, more unsettling insight follows. Reason for Hume is not the sovereign we imagine. It clarifies, compares and corrects, but our actual beliefs and actions spring from deeper sources: instinct, passion and feeling. This is clearest in ethics. Our sense of right and wrong is rooted in sentiment, in the warm and cool tones of approval and disapproval, and in sympathy, our natural capacity to feel with others. Across this journey, Hume offers a naturalistic picture of the mind human, limited yet rich. As we walk further with him, you are invited to turn this experiment inward, watching your own impressions, your habits of expectation, and the quiet, emotional currents beneath your reasons. Part 1. The Science of Human Nature. Beneath our confidence in science and common sense lies a quieter assumption we rarely notice, that the mind doing the thinking is already understood. David Hume begins by refusing that assumption. Before trusting any grand theory about the world, he wants to know what kind of creature is forming those theories in the first place. He calls this project a science of human nature. The phrase sounds modest, almost clinical, but for Hume it is revolutionary. Instead of using philosophy to soar above experience and pronounce on God, the soul, or the ultimate structure of reality, he asks us to do something simpler. Look carefully at experience itself. Pay attention to what actually passes through the mind. Do not invent. Do not guess at hidden essences. Treat the mind as Newton treated the heavens, something to be observed, measured, and patiently mapped. Hume had grown up reading the great systems of the past, ancient philosophers, then the moderns who claimed to have broken free from them. On paper, they disagreed about almost everything. Yet in their methods, Hume saw the same flaw repeating. Too much reliance on subtle invention, too little on the stubborn facts of human nature. Everywhere he turned he found disputes that never ended, terms that were never clearly defined, and arguments that promised certainty while floating free of any real experience. He thought the contrast with the new physical sciences was striking. In a few generations, natural philosophers had learned to predict eclipses, trace planetary motions, and uncover laws of motion and gravity. Their success, Hume believed, was not a gift from genius alone. It came from a discipline of mind. They had learned to mistrust bold hypotheses, to test ideas against observation, and to abandon theories that did not fit what nature actually showed them. Why, he wondered, had philosophy not made a similar advance? Why were questions about the mind, morality, religion, and politics still mired in old controversies? His diagnosis was blunt. Philosophers had never truly given up their passion for hypotheses and systems. They still tried to penetrate beyond all possible experience, to speak confidently of invisible substances, immaterial souls, and divine attributes. They mistook the feeling of depth for genuine understanding. Hume's response is not to abandon philosophy, but to change its target. If we cannot reliably speak about what lies beyond all experience, then philosophy should concentrate on what lies squarely within it, the workings of the human mind. What do we actually find when we turn inward with the same patience a scientist brings to a laboratory? We find perceptions, sensations, feelings, desires, memories and faint images in thought, beliefs that grip us more firmly than daydreams. These are the raw materials of any science of man. This project has two sides. The first is descriptive. Hume wants to chart the mind's terrain, to draw a kind of mental map. What basic kinds of perceptions are there? How do they differ? How are they arranged? This is what he sometimes calls a mental geography, or an anatomy of the mind. It is not surgery, but a careful separation of parts that we usually experience all at once. The second side is explanatory. Description alone is not enough. Hume wants to uncover the secret springs and principles that govern how perceptions arise, fade, and interact. Newton had shown how diverse motions in the heavens could be explained by a few simple laws like gravity. Hume hopes that something similar might be true of the mind. Beneath the chaos of thoughts and feelings, there might be a small set of principles that explain how one perception gives rise to another, and why belief, passion, and action are connected as they are. Yet there is an important limit. Hume refuses to go beyond experience in searching for these principles. We may look for patterns, for regularities in how the mind behaves. We may even arrange them into something like laws. But when we reach the point where no further explanation is grounded in observation, we must stop. To push further is not depth, it is fiction. For Hume, this is not a failure. It is simply an honest recognition of where human understanding ends. From this vantage point, even the other sciences look different. Mathematics, physics, theology, politics, all of them are human activities. All of them depend on what humans can perceive, imagine, remember, and believe. If we misunderstand those capacities, our theories in every domain risk drifting away from their own foundations. The science of human nature becomes, in this sense, the ground on which all other sciences quietly stand. There is, in Hume's project, a curious mixture of humility and ambition. Humility because he gives up the dream of piercing to the very core of reality. Ambition because he hopes to transform philosophy by bringing it under the same discipline that made natural science flourish. And it all begins with something each of us can do. At any moment watch, from the inside, how experience presents itself. In the chapters that follow, we will trace Hume's attempt to build this science from the ground up. His first move is simple but powerful. He asks us to distinguish, within the flow of consciousness, between the forceful presence of sensations and emotions and the fainter images we find in memory and imagination. From this modest distinction between impressions and ideas, his entire reimagining of the mind begins. Part 2. Impressions and Ideas. Consider the subtle difference between a pain you feel now and a pain you merely remember. If you burn your hand on a hot pan, the sensation is sharp, immediate, almost unavoidable. If you think back to a burn from last summer, the memory is clearer or fainter, depending on your mood. But it does not seize you in quite the same way. That contrast, familiar to everyone, is where Hume starts. He invites us to look inward and notice the contents of our minds without theory. Every moment, something is present to us: a colour, a sound, a taste, a bodily sensation, a mood, a desire, a passing image, a half-formed thought. Hume gathers all of these under a single name: perceptions. The term is broad on purpose. It does not mean just the five senses. It covers anything that can appear before the mind. Among these perceptions, Hume sees a basic division. Some strike us with a certain force and liveliness. The taste of coffee as it hits the tongue. The stab of jealousy when someone else receives the praise we wanted. The startle of a loud noise in the night. Others are much weaker. The image of coffee you picture when the cup is empty. The memory of past envy no longer burning in the same way. The dim outline of a childhood room that you can almost, but not quite, reconstruct. Hume calls the more forceful perceptions impressions. They include all sensations, as well as passions, emotions, and desires as we actually feel them. The weaker ones he calls ideas, the faint images of those impressions when we think, remember, or imagine. We do not need philosophical training to grasp the difference. We feel it whenever we compare a vivid experience with its afterglow in thought. Sometimes Hume likens the distinction to that between reality and a picture, or between a bright original and a faded copy. This does not mean that impressions are somehow more real than ideas. Both are real as events in the mind. The difference is in their felt intensity. Impressions are vivid, immediate, almost intrusive. Ideas are gentler, more easily manipulated, more easily ignored. Within both impressions and ideas, Hume finds another division: simple and complex. A simple perception is one that cannot be broken down into parts. The redness of a ripe tomato considered just as red. The raw sensation of warmth against the skin. The single note of a flute. Complex perceptions are composed out of many such elements. The full experience of seeing and smelling the tomato, the sound of an entire melody. The whole appearance of a crowded street at noon. This distinction matters because of a further insight. It is relatively easy for the mind to break complex perceptions apart in thought. You can focus on the smell of the tomato while bracketing its color, or imagine a melody played on a different instrument. You can picture a golden mountain even if you have never seen one, by combining the idea of gold with the idea of a mountain. Our imagination, in this sense, seems wonderfully free. It can mix and match almost without limit. Yet Hume insists that this freedom is not absolute. However wildly we may combine and rearrange all the materials we work with, the basic, simple elements must ultimately come from impressions. You cannot imagine a new basic color if you have never had any color experience at all. You cannot form an idea of pain if you have never felt anything like it. Thought may travel far, but its building blocks are always drawn from experience. The mind also contains impressions of reflection as well as impressions of sensation. Impressions of sensation arise, originally, from unknown causes. They are just there: the sting of cold air, the sweetness of fruit, the dull ache of fatigue. Impressions of reflection are different. They are our emotional and motivational reactions to ideas we already have. You remember last year's sunburn and immediately feel fear of being burned again. You picture a possible future, success, and feel hope or eagerness. The memory and the imagined scene are ideas. The fear and hope are impressions of reflection. This layered structure, impressions of sensation, ideas as their faint copies, and then new impressions of reflection responding to those ideas, allows Hume to see the mind as a kind of living circulation. Experience strikes us. Its traces linger as ideas. Those ideas in turn stir new feelings, which push us toward action. Instead of a cold machine manipulating representations, Hume's mind is warm, responsive, and continually moved by what it has already undergone. Notice what this picture quietly rules out. If every idea we can genuinely form must be traceable, in some way, back to impressions, then we should be wary of ideas that seem to float free of any such origin. Terms like substance, necessary connection, or even certain ways of speaking about the self and about God will later come under Hume's scrutiny. He will ask of each what impression gives rise to this idea. If none can be found, perhaps there is less to the term than we think. For now, it is enough to hold on to the basic map. The mind presents us with perceptions. Some are strong, vivid, and immediate impressions. Others are weak, faint, and derivative ideas. Both can be simple or complex. And the imagination, however inventive, never escapes this circle. It begins and ends with what has, in some form, already appeared. This is the starting point for Hume's deeper principle, the claim that every simple idea is a copy of a simple impression. Part 3. The Copy Principle. Sometimes philosophy advances not by a dazzling new theory, but by a quiet restriction. Hume's copy principle is like that. It does not tell us what to think about God, matter, or the self. Instead, it tells us how far any thinking can legitimately go. The principle begins with a simple observation. When we look closely at our ideas, the faint images we use in thinking and reasoning we find that they resemble earlier impressions. The idea of a particular shade of red echoes the vivid experience of seeing it. The idea of pain resembles, in a softened way, the sharpness of the original hurt. Trace your ideas back, and you will usually find some impression that came before. Hume sharpens this into a rule. Every simple idea, he claims, is derived from a corresponding simple impression. For every basic mental element you can think, there was once a more forceful version felt. The mind never invents simple ideas entirely out of nothing. Where there is no impression, there can be no genuine idea. He does not present this as a mere guess. He challenges us to test it against our own experience. Take any simple idea you like, of colour, sound, taste, motion, pleasure, pain, or anything else, and ask yourself where it came from. If you follow its trail honestly, you will find Hume thinks that an impression of the same kind lies at its origin. We do not have ideas of colours we have never seen, or of tastes we have never sampled, or of feelings we have never in any way undergone. A few well-chosen examples make the point concrete. Suppose you want to give a child an idea of the taste of pineapple. You do not lecture, define, or describe. You simply give her a piece of pineapple to eat. The impression does the work. The taste appears with all its force. And later, when it is no longer present, the child can recall a fainter image of it. The idea has been formed by experience, not by explanation. Or imagine a person born blind. However well he learns our language, Hume thinks he cannot possess the very idea of colour. He may use the word red in the right contexts, but that is not the same as having the inner image or appearance that sighted people report. Because he never had impressions of colour, no corresponding ideas can inhabit his mind. Words alone cannot conjure up basic perceptions that have never, in any form, been felt. From these and countless small confirmations, Hume draws a stronger conclusion. The connection between simple impressions and simple ideas is not a matter of chance. It is constant. Impressions come first with all their force and vivacity. Ideas follow after as weakened copies. The direction of dependence is clear. Impressions cause ideas, not the other way around. There is, however, a subtle wrinkle that Hume himself notes. He asks us to imagine someone who has experienced every common shade of blue except one. Line up all the shades he knows from darkest to lightest, and there will be a gap in the sequence. Could he, by reflection alone, supply the missing shade in thought? Hume suggests that he probably could. In that case, we would have a simple idea of that missing shade for which there was no matching prior impression. Rather than seeing this as a refutation, Hume calls it an odd but unimportant exception. It shows, he thinks, how rare such cases are and how strong the general rule remains. Even here, notice that the imagined shade is not utterly foreign. It is anchored between two very similar impressions. The mind is not leaping beyond all experience, it is interpolating within it. What matters for Hume is not mathematical rigour, but a working discipline. The copy principle becomes his main tool for examining our most impressive sounding concepts. When a philosopher appeals to the substantial self, or to a mysterious, necessary connection in nature, or to some lofty, infinite perfection, Hume responds with a simple question. From which impression is this idea copied? If no suitable impression can be found, then perhaps we are dealing with a mere word, an empty sound to which no clear content corresponds. This is why the principle is so powerful. It does not tell us that any particular doctrine is false. It tells us how to test whether a doctrine is even meaningful. An idea we cannot in any way relate back to experience may not be an idea at all. It may be a shadow we mistake for a shape, or a verbal habit we confuse with understanding. At the same time, the copy principle is not purely negative. It also reassures us about the ideas that do pass the test. Once we see that our concepts of body-mind, pleasure, pain, motion, and number are grounded in impressions, we can be more confident in using them. They are not empty abstractions. They are compact ways of organizing what we have actually lived through. Hume's hope is that, by quietly applying this principle, we can clear away a great deal of speculative fog. What remains will not be a final picture of reality, but a more honest picture of ourselves, creatures whose thinking is always rooted in experience, whose most elevated notions begin in humble impressions. From that cleared ground, he will go on to examine how our ideas link together, how belief arises, and how our habits of expectation give the world its apparent solidity. Part 4. The Microscope of Definition. In Hume's hands, philosophy becomes less a grand system and more a kind of careful examination, not the examination of stars or stones, but of the very tools with which we think, our ideas, our words, and the faint impressions behind them. If a science of human nature is to be honest, he thinks it must begin here with a simple but demanding discipline. Never trust a term until you have looked closely at the idea it stands for. Hume believes that much of traditional metaphysics went wrong because it never really made this turn. Philosophers, theologians, and even everyday thinkers often move comfortably inside what he calls a circle of words. We explain one obscure term with another that is only slightly clearer. We trade in high-sounding language, substance, essence, cause, spirit, necessity, without ever stopping to ask whether we genuinely possess a clear idea that could answer to each word. For Hume, this is not a minor problem in style. It is a deep confusion about meaning itself. If thought is ultimately grounded in experience, then our words only have content. When they can be traced back, step by step, to something that has appeared to the mind. Without that link, we are speaking in a kind of philosophical echo chamber, responding to sounds rather than to realities. His copy principle tells one side of this story. Every legitimate idea, he says, is copied from some impression, some vivid sensation, emotion, or feeling that has appeared in experience. The mind can rearrange, amplify, and combine these copies, but it cannot leap beyond them. From this, Hume draws a remarkable reversal. If every genuine idea must ultimately be copied from an impression, then we can work backwards. We can start from the idea and ask what impression could possibly have given rise to it. This, he thinks, gives us a new instrument, for philosophy, a kind of conceptual microscope. Just as an optical microscope lets us test what is really present in a drop of water, his mental microscope lets us test what is really present in our ideas. When he calls it a new kind of optics, he is not simply being poetic. He truly believes that, if used carefully, this method could transform the moral sciences, just as physical instruments transformed astronomy and physics. The procedure itself is disarmingly simple. Begin with a term that feels important, perhaps one that has generated long disputes. Ask yourself, what idea do I actually have when I use this word? Can I call to mind something clear and determinate, something I can mentally handle, compare, and imagine in different situations? If the answer is no, if the term brings only a hazy feeling or is filled out by other equally murky words, then, for Hume, it has no genuine cognitive content. It is noise masquerading as thought. Suppose, however, that an idea does seem to be attached to the term. The second step is to examine its structure. Many of our ideas are not simple, like a single colour patch or a particular sound. They are complex. The idea of a person, for example, may include a face, a voice, a posture, a way of acting over time. When we have a complex idea, Hume asks us to break it down. Can we separate it in imagination into simpler components? Can we list the elements that seem to be woven together in this single mental package? Once we have those simpler elements, a third step follows. We now trace each simple idea back to its origin in experience. For every basic component, we ask, what impression did this come from? A particular shade of blue may recall the sight of the sky at dusk. The feeling of warmth may recall a fire. The sensation of resistance may recall our hand pressing a table. If for some element we cannot find any corresponding impression, no vivid sensory or emotional source, then, by Hume's lights, that element is empty. The complex idea that depended on it is, at least in part, meaningless. When this process succeeds, when each component of a complex idea can be traced back to a clear, original impression, Hume says we have achieved a proper definition. Not the sort of definition that simply replaces one word with another, but a revealing account of the actual mental content involved. We understand what we mean because we can see the experiential material from which the idea was assembled. This tool has both a destructive and a constructive use in his system. In its critical use, it allows Hume to challenge some of the central notions of traditional metaphysics. Take, for instance, talk of a substantial self, a simple, unchanging entity that underlies our experiences. When he looks for the impression that could ground such an idea, Hume finds only a shifting bundle of perceptions, sensations, emotions, thoughts that rise and dissolve. There is no single, invariant impression of a self to copy. The grand metaphysical term, under the microscope, turns out to have no clear content. The same treatment can be applied to talk of necessary connections in nature, or of purely spiritual substances, or of absolute space and time, existing even when nothing is present. Often Hume suggests we will find that our supposed ideas are little more than familiar sounds attached to habits of speaking. We feel as though we grasp something profound, but when we look for the impression that could have given rise to that grasp, our hands close on air. In its constructive use, the microscope of definition helps him clarify and refine the ideas he is willing to admit. When he speaks of cause, or power, or belief, he will not be content with a loose, inherited vocabulary. He wants to show exactly what sequence of impressions and mental operations makes up each notion. This is not an exercise in tidiness. It is part of his larger naturalistic project to explain our thinking in terms of human nature rather than in terms of mysterious faculties or transcendent realms. There is a broader lesson in this method, one that reaches beyond historical debates. Many of our own most charged words, freedom, self, meaning, divinity, even rationality, can be brought under the same lens. We can ask, with Hume, when I use this word, what exactly am I bringing before my mind? Can I feel its edges, see its parts, and trace them back to experience? Or am I moving within a circle of inherited language, warmed more by tradition and emotion than by understanding? Hume does not offer the microscope of definition as a device of cynicism. He is not saying that any idea that is hard to analyze must be discarded. Rather, he invites us to adopt a disciplined humility. Before we stake our lives, or condemn others, or build world, pictures out of grand abstractions, we should be willing to look closely. If an idea survives this scrutiny, it stands on firmer ground. If it dissolves, that too is a kind of clarity. Either way, the exercise sharpens our sense of what it means to think at all. In this way, his account of definition quietly reshapes the landscape of philosophy. The highest questions about God, the soul, causality, and morality now depend on a simple internal test. Can you show me the impressions from which these ideas are drawn? The rest of Hume's project unfolds from this point. Once we know how to examine our ideas, we can turn to the forces that connect them and to the habits that lead us from what we have seen to what we expect. That is where his theory of the association of ideas begins. Part 5, the association of ideas. Across human life, the stream of thought never truly stops. Images, memories, questions, worries, and plans follow one another in a shifting procession. Yet this flow is not pure chaos. We do not find ourselves thinking of a childhood toy, then immediately of a distant galaxy, then a random number with no pattern or connection. Instead, there is a kind of quiet order in our ordinary mental life, a fascinating puzzle for thinkers like Hume. Hume is fascinated by this order. If the mind contains only impressions and ideas, and if it is free to combine them in many ways, why don't our thoughts simply scatter? Why does a faint smell suddenly recall a particular room or a decade of your life? What is it that ties one idea to the next in the flowing chain of consciousness? His answer is that there are natural principles of association. The mind, by its original constitution, is disposed to let certain ideas call up others. These connections are not like rigid, logical proofs. They can be resisted, interrupted, or overridden. Instead, Hume describes them as a gentle force, a tendency built into our nature by which one idea introduces another into view. To uncover these principles, Hume does not consult an abstract theory of mind. He invites us once again to inward observation. Watch your own thinking for a while. See how one thought leads to the next, not in intense reasoning, but in casual reverie or memory. Over time, a pattern emerges. The transitions are not random. They follow a small number of familiar paths. Hume claims that, at the most basic level, there are 3 such paths: resemblance, contiguity, and cause and effect. Resemblance is perhaps the most straightforward. One thing reminds us of another because it is similar in some salient way. A portrait makes you think of the person it depicts. A fictional character echoes someone you know in real life, and suddenly that person's face rises in your mind. A melody you hear today recalls a song from years ago that shares its rhythm. The likeness itself is enough to spark the transition without needing active reasoning. Contiguity refers to closeness in space or time. Places and periods tend to come bundled in our memories. Think of your school, and your mind may drift from classroom to hallway to playground, tracing the layout of the building. Think of a particular year, perhaps the first time you lived away from home, and a cluster of events from that season crowd in together. One episode evokes the next, not because of resemblance, but because they once occurred side by side. Causation for Hume is the most powerful principle of all. When we see one kind of event regularly followed by another, fire and heat, impact and motion, injury and pain, we begin to associate them. The sight of the one naturally brings the idea of the other. Striking a match makes you think of flame. Hearing thunder makes you think of lightning. Seeing a parent makes you think of the child, and vice versa. These transitions run not only from cause to effect, but also from effect back to cause. This third principle is special because it reaches beyond the present. Resemblance and contiguity usually connect things that are already before us in some way, either now or in memory. Causation is what allows the mind to move from what is currently given to what is not yet seen. From dark clouds we leap to the idea of rain. From certain symptoms we infer an illness. From past patterns we project future outcomes. In this sense, Hume says, nearly all our reasoning about matters of fact rests on causal association. These three principles are, he thinks, original features of human nature. Like gravity in the physical world, they are not explained by something deeper within his system. They are among the basic tendencies with which the mind is endowed. We can describe their effects, test their reach, and trace the structures they produce. But if we ask why the mind associates as it does, Hume is content to say this is how our nature is built. To demand a further explanation, he warns, is to slip back into speculative metaphysics, chasing causes that lie forever beyond experience. There is, nevertheless, a great deal we can learn by taking these principles seriously. They help explain the difference between sanity and confusion. A mind in which association breaks down, where thoughts are loose, disconnected, and unpredictable, cannot sustain coherent reasoning or stable identity. At the same time, an overly rigid pattern of association can imprison us in habits and prejudices. Much of human life is lived within the paths these principles carve out, but we are not entirely their prisoners. We can notice, reflect, and sometimes alter how we move from one idea to another. Hume also sees in association the seeds of our more complex achievements. Memory relies on these principles to knit fragments of experience into a continuous story. Imagination depends on them to wander productively, combining old materials into new forms, rather than merely scrambling them at random. Science builds on causal association to frame laws and predictions. Even morality draws on patterns of resemblance and sympathy as we extend our concern from those who are near and familiar to those who are distant. In an important sense, these principles are the glue of our experienced world. Without them, impressions and ideas would remain isolated flashes. With them, we perceive sequences, patterns, and structures. We come to think of there being a world at all, a world in which things persist, relate, and change according to recognizable connections. Hume is careful, though, to mark a limit. The fact that our mind is naturally inclined to associate in these ways does not, by itself, guarantee that the world must conform to every one of our expectations. The link from past experiences to future predictions, from what we have seen to what we believe will happen, is especially delicate. It is grounded in causal association, which feels compelling. Yet when we ask what justifies this feeling, what entitles us to move from past patterns to future confidence, Hume thinks we run into trouble. That trouble leads directly into his most famous set of reflections, his skeptical doubts about induction, or about our reasoning from experience. The same principles of association that give us a sense of a stable, law-governed world also tempt us to forget the limits of what reason can prove. To understand that tension, we have to look more closely at how we infer causes and effects at all, and what, if anything, supports our leap from what has been to what will be. Part 6. Skeptical doubts on induction. When Hume turns to the topic of causal inference, he is addressing something absolutely central to human life. Almost everything we care about depends on our ability to move from what we have observed to what we have not yet seen. We take medicine expecting it to heal. We plant seeds expecting them to grow. We greet someone with a certain tone expecting a roughly predictable response. All of this rests on one basic pattern of thought. From past experience, we draw conclusions about the future. Hume gives this pattern a name: reasoning from cause to effect, or more broadly, reasoning from experience. He also gives it a more technical label, induction. And he asks a seemingly simple question: what justifies it? What exactly licenses our move from the record of what has happened to a belief about what will happen next? To approach this, Hume brings back a distinction that runs through his work: the difference between relations of ideas and matters of fact. Relations of ideas include truths of logic and mathematics, claims like all bachelors are unmarried, or 2 + 3 = 5. They are certain, and their opposites are impossible. You cannot coherently imagine that 2 + 3 might suddenly become 7 tomorrow. Matters of fact, by contrast, concern the actual world, the weather, the outcome of a battle, the effects of a drug. Their opposites are always conceivable. You can imagine it raining or not raining tomorrow without contradiction. Every piece of reasoning, Hume thinks, must belong to one of these two families. So if the connection between a cause and its effect is established by reason, it must be either a relation of ideas or a matter of fact. He begins by showing that it cannot be a relation of ideas. Imagine, he suggests, a person suddenly brought into the world as an adult, with a brilliant intellect but no prior experience. Place before this person an object they have never encountered: a stone, a flame, a piece of metal, a pill of aspirin. Could they, just by examining the object and reflecting on its qualities, discover what effects it will produce? Could they, from the idea of the pill alone, conclude that it will relieve headaches? Hume's answer is no. When we consider the idea of a possible cause, say, the pill, we can list its apparent properties, its colour, shape, size, texture, smell, and so on. But the effect, relief of pain, is something entirely distinct. There is no contradiction in thinking of the pill existing without the headache disappearing. The two ideas are separable in thought. That means there is no purely logical tie, no relation of ideas that binds cause to effect. This point is easy to overlook in everyday life because we are so used to seeing certain pairs together. Fire and heat, bread and nourishment, impact and movement. The constant conjunction of such events produces a feeling of necessity in us. We come to think that the cause somehow contains its effect. Hume asks us to strip away that habit, at least for a moment, and notice that the mere idea of the cause does not include the effect. Any supposed must we feel is not supplied by reason. If the connection is not a relation of ideas, it must involve matters of fact and experience. Here Hume seems more optimistic. Of course we cannot know the powers of objects in advance, he grants. But once we have observed a regular pattern, fire repeatedly burning, pills repeatedly curing headaches, surely we are entitled to infer that the same will hold in the future. This is where his famous skepticism takes its shape. He concedes that we do, as a matter of fact, make this move. We encounter many instances of one event consistently following another, and we come to speak of the first as the cause and the second as the effect. We begin to expect the second when we see the first. The real question is not whether we make such inferences, but whether reason requires them or can justify them. Consider a simple example. In the past, every time you have taken a particular medicine, your fever has gone down. You now take the same medicine again, and you expect, indeed, you feel almost certain that the fever will go down this time as well. Your past experience can be summarized in a statement like this. In all previous cases, this kind of medicine has been followed by a reduction in fever. Your present expectation can be expressed as, in the next case, this same kind of medicine will again be followed by a reduction in fever. The move from the first statement to the second is precisely what Hume wants to examine. Is there a chain of reasoning that takes us from the record of past conjunctions to a prediction about the future? If there is, it must be either demonstrative concerning relations of ideas or probable, concerning matters of fact. Demonstrative reasoning cannot do the job. No matter how many times medicine and relief have been conjoined in the past, Hume insists we can always conceive that things might go differently next time. There is no contradiction in imagining that the course of nature could change, that the next dose might fail, or even harm. If such a reversal is conceivable without absurdity, then no logical proof can rule it out. Necessity of the sort we find in mathematics is simply not available here. We turn, then, to probable reasoning, to reasoning based on experience, likelihoods, and patterns. Perhaps we can say, given that this connection has held many times before, it is probable that it will hold again. But Hume presses further. On what does this probability itself rest? Why are past instances relevant to future ones at all? Any attempt to answer seems to smuggle in an additional principle, something like this: the future will resemble the past, or more specifically, instances of which we have no experience will conform to those of which we have experience, so long as they appear similar. Call this the principle of the uniformity of nature. If we grant it, then indeed we can move from our past observations to future expectations. Yet this principle itself is neither self-evident nor demonstrable. Its denial is perfectly intelligible. We can imagine a world in which nature behaves regularly for a long time and then suddenly shifts its patterns. So if we are to justify it, we must do so not by pure reason, but by appealing, once again, to experience. We might say, in the past, nature has behaved uniformly, therefore it is probable that it will continue to do so. Here the circle becomes visible. To argue from past uniformity to future uniformity is already to assume that the past is a good guide to the future, that nature is uniform. We use the very principle we are trying to justify in order to justify it. Probable reasoning, in this context, leans on itself. At this point, Hume reaches his unsettling conclusion. Our inferences from past to future are inductive inferences, cannot be justified by reason, whether demonstrative or probable. There is no chain of arguments that compels us to believe that what has been will continue to be. We do believe this, and we rely on it constantly. But the source of this reliance is not an operation of the understanding that could be laid out as a proof. It would be easy to hear this as an invitation to despair, as though Hume were telling us that our expectations are irrational and that science, common sense, and everyday life are built on an illusion. He is more measured than that. He does call his reflections sceptical doubts, but he does not present them as the final word. Instead, he treats them as a clearing of the ground, an honest acknowledgement of what reason can and cannot do. Once we see that reason cannot carry us from past to future, a different question arises: what does move us? Why do we, in practice, feel so sure that the sun will rise, that bread will nourish, that unsupported stones will fall? Hume's answer, which he develops in the constructive phase of his inquiry, is that this confidence comes from custom or habit. The mind, having been repeatedly exposed to the same conjunctions, forms a disposition to expect one event upon experiencing the other. This disposition feels like necessity, but does not arise from reasoning. By placing custom, rather than reason, at the heart of our beliefs about the world, Hume offers both a humbling and a naturalistic picture. We are not, as he sees it, the kind of beings who look out on nature, discern its secret laws by pure intellect, and then rationally infer all that follows. We are creatures who learn by repetition, whose nervous systems and imaginations are shaped by patterns. Our confidence in tomorrow is, in the end, a refined instinct. The skeptical doubts on induction, then, are not meant to paralyze us. They are meant to realign our self-understanding. We continue to rely on causal inference. Indeed, we cannot live without it. But we do so knowing that reason alone does not underwrite this reliance. Something deeper and more animal in our nature does the work. This recognition will have far-reaching consequences in the rest of Hume's project. It will inform his view of belief as a vivid feeling, his account of the necessity we think we perceive in causes, and even his understanding of moral judgment. For now, it offers a kind of reflective pause. The next time you find yourself confidently predicting what will happen, a friend's reaction, a machine's behavior, the outcome of a habit, you might quietly recall Hume's question, what exactly supports that leap? The answer, if he is right, lies not in some hidden chain of arguments, but in the well-worn pathways of your own mind. Part 7. Custom as the Guide of Life. Among our most ordinary experiences, there is a quiet pattern that rarely draws attention. You wake, reach for the same side of the bed, walk to the kitchen, and expect water to run when you turn the tap. You assume the floor will hold your weight. You trust that the sun, which has risen on every previous morning of your life, will rise again. None of this feels remarkable. It feels like the background music of existence. Yet if we pause, Hume suggests something curious appears. None of these expectations is guaranteed by reason alone. There is no logical contradiction in imagining that tomorrow the ground gives way, the tap runs dry, or the sun does not rise. Our confidence in the future is not the conclusion of an argument we have carefully checked. It is something deeper, quieter, and far more automatic. Earlier, when we considered the problem of induction, this automatic trust came under pressure. We noticed that no chain of reasoning can strictly prove that the future must resemble the past. From the fact that bread has always nourished us, it does not follow, by pure logic, that it will nourish us tomorrow. Reason can compare ideas, trace definitions, and expose contradictions, but it cannot bridge this gap from what has been to what will be. If reason cannot do the work, why are we not frozen in doubt? Why does life not collapse into permanent suspense? Hume's answer is as simple as it is disarming. The mind has another principle, one that operates with a weight and authority equal to reason, but of a very different kind. He calls it custom or habit. Over time, repeated experiences leave traces. The mind, having observed one type of event constantly followed by another, begins to glide, almost without effort, from the first to the expectation of the second. Think of walking a path across a field. The first time, the grass is tall, the way forward uncertain. After many journeys, a track appears. Your feet find it even when you are not paying attention. Custom works like that pathway, carved not into the earth, but into the patterns of thought. When you see dark clouds, your mind moves toward the idea of rain. When you strike a match, it moves toward the idea of flame. No fresh reasoning is required. The movement is eased by repetition. For Hume, this is not a mysterious new faculty. It is a name for how the principles of association work when they are strengthened by experience. Ideas that have often appeared together in a fixed order become tightly bound. The sight of one does not merely remind you of the other as a distant possibility. It feels like a natural prelude. As this bond tightens, expectation takes on a sense of inevitability. You do not just imagine that fire will burn. You anticipate it with a kind of inner leaning, a forward movement of the mind. This is why Hume calls custom the great guide of life. It is custom that carries us beyond the narrow limits of what we presently see and remember. A child touches a candle once and feels pain. After a few such encounters, the child no longer reaches into the flame. No one has explained induction to the child. No argument has been laid out and accepted. The mind has simply learned to move from one impression to another, and this movement now shapes action. Science itself quietly rests on this guide. The physicist, after countless observations and experiments, writes a law. Whenever conditions of a certain kind are present, effects of a certain kind follow. This is a refined form of the same habit the child exhibits. It is more measured, more cautious, loaded with careful qualifications, but at its heart lies the mind's tendency to project patterns forward. The difference is one of discipline and scale, not of basic psychological mechanism. Custom's power is reassuring, but it also carries a warning. Because the mind forms habits wherever it finds repetition, not only truth but error can become settled. A few coincidences, misinterpreted, can harden into superstition. One or two painful encounters with a certain kind of person can solidify into prejudice. Here again, the mind moves from the past to the future, but the pattern it has seized is partial or distorted. What guides us so reliably through ordinary life can, in other contexts, quietly mislead. Hume does not offer a way to step entirely outside this process. We cannot choose to live without custom any more than we can choose to live without breathing. What philosophy can offer, instead, is a more lucid view of what is happening. We can recognize that our most stable expectations are not the verdict of a purely rational faculty, but the accumulated weight of repeated experience. We can ask where the patterns that govern us come from, and whether they are as secure or as universal as they feel. There is a deep humility in this picture. It does not deny the astonishing regularities of nature. It does not claim that tomorrow is likely to betray all of yesterday. It simply places the source of our forward-looking confidence where it belongs in a natural, instinctive tendency of the human mind. We expect the future to resemble the past because, over time, we have become creatures who cannot help doing so. As you move through your own routines, you can watch this guide at work. Notice how quickly you anticipate the ending of a familiar melody, the likely response of a friend, the taste of food you have not yet bitten. None of this is forced. It rises unbidden. For Hume, this gentle, persistent force of custom is what rescues us from the paralysis of pure skepticism. It anchors a mind that would otherwise drift among possibilities, giving it a practical direction, even if not the absolute certainty reason once promised. To see custom as the guide of life is not to despise it, nor to worship it. It is to understand that between rigid, proof and complete chaos lies a middle terrain, shaped by habit, experience, and the repeated rhythms of the world. That is where we actually live. Philosophy's task, in Hume's hands, is to illuminate this terrain so that we walk it with clear eyes, aware of both its reliability and its limits. Part 8. The sentiment of belief. In moments of hesitation, you can often feel the difference between simply entertaining an idea and truly believing it. You might imagine that a distant city has been destroyed, or that a friend has fallen ill, yet remain emotionally untouched. Then a message arrives, A few lines of text, a trembling voice on the phone, and suddenly the very same idea grips you. The world feels altered. What has changed? For Hume, this question runs deeper than it first appears. When we say that we believe something, rather than merely conceive it, what are we adding? The idea itself seems the same. The thought that your friend is ill has the same content whether you are imagining it as a possibility or accepting it as a fact. If belief were a separate idea, a kind of mental label that we tack on, we ought to be able to fix it wherever we please. We could simply decide to attach the stamp of belief to any notion whatsoever. But our experience shows otherwise. We cannot believe at will. We can repeat words, behave as if something were true, even try to persuade ourselves, yet the inner sense of conviction resists direct command. There is something stubbornly involuntary about belief. It comes, when it comes, not as a pure decision, but as a change in how an idea is felt. This leads Hume to a subtle but powerful claim. Belief, he suggests, is not a new idea added to others. It is a sentiment, a particular way in which an idea is held in the mind. The content remains the same, but its manner of appearance shifts. Some ideas arrive faint and pale, like sketches in pencil. Others come with weight, with a certain firmness, as if printed in ink. Belief belongs to this second class. It is an idea made lively, steady, and resistant. You can sense this in the contrast between fiction and report. The story you read in a novel may be more vivid, more detailed, and more emotionally rich than a brief note about a real event. Yet somewhere in your experience there is a quiet mark of difference. You carry the novel lightly. It does not guide your plans. You carry the report differently. Even if you do not dwell on it, it sits in the background of your sense of what is now the case. Its idea is, in Hume's terms, more forceful and vivacious. Where does this extra liveliness come from? Hume turns again to custom. When two kinds of event have regularly followed one another in your experience, the mind develops a propensity to move from the one to the idea of the other. If you have often taken medicine and found relief, the sight or memory of the pill does not only call up the bare possibility of improvement, it sends a kind of energy along the familiar path, enlivening the idea of relief until it feels firm. The present impression, strong and immediate, lends some of its strength to the associated idea. Notice how deeply this process is rooted in circumstance rather than sheer choice. If you have just swallowed the medicine, the idea of impending relief springs up in a way it would not if you merely imagined taking it. Something about the here and now, combined with your past observations, pushes the mind into a particular posture. In these moments, Hume thinks, believing is as natural and as unchosen as feeling affection for a long-time friend or irritation at an obvious insult. These are not states you produce by argument. They are responses that arise from who you are and where you stand. This account might sound as if it makes belief entirely subjective, a mere feeling floating free of the world. Hume's point is subtler. He does not deny that there is a world, nor that it regularly pushes back against our errors. What he insists on is that the act of taking a thought as reality rather than as a possibility is something that happens in us. It is a psychological event with its own texture and causes, and it follows laws of its own. To see belief in this way is to recognize its close tie to action. An idea that leaves you cold, no matter how elaborate, will not move your hand. An idea that comes clothed in the sentiment of belief rearranges your priorities. Think of a medical diagnosis you had once considered remotely possible, and then one day are told is definite. The words you hear may not introduce any new concept, but they alter the weight of that concept in your mind. The future shifts. Decisions that were abstract now demand attention. Belief on this picture is like a bridge from imagination to conduct. On one side are countless images, hypotheses, and stories. On the other side are choices, habits, and emotions. What turns a mere story into a guide? For life is not its complexity or its beauty, but this added firmness, this felt assurance that things are indeed as the story says. Custom, by repeatedly pairing certain impressions with certain outcomes, is what most often supplies that firmness. This view also explains why our beliefs can be so unevenly distributed. Some parts of a creed, a political stance, or a personal narrative may be held with great intensity because they are constantly reinforced by experience, conversation, and daily practice. Other parts remain shadowy, accepted perhaps in words, but never taking root in feeling. We may assent to a doctrine that all humans are mortal, yet live for long stretches as if death were a distant rumour. Then an accident, an illness, or a loss may suddenly make that same idea blaze into conviction. Hume's description invites a new kind of introspection. Instead of asking only what you believe, you can begin to notice how strongly, how vividly you believe it. You can observe the slow work of repetition, how hearing the same claim, in the same tone from the same sources, steadily increases its sense of obviousness, whether or not it was ever argued for. You can watch how proximity, emotion, and personal stake amplify or dim the liveliness of ideas. None of this means that belief is an illusion. Hume is not urging us to give up our convictions and float among mere possibilities. Rather, he is offering a natural history of belief, a way of understanding how our minds move from bare conception to felt assurance. Once we see belief as a sentiment shaped by custom and circumstance, we may grow more careful about the environments we inhabit, the stories we rehearse, and the patterns of experience that silently tune the force of our ideas. In this light, the sentiment of belief becomes both inevitable and fragile. Inevitable because human life cannot proceed without some ideas clothed in conviction. Fragile because we now see how easily its intensity can outstrip the evidence or fail to keep pace with it. Between cold skepticism and unreflective certainty, Hume suggests a middle stance, to live by our natural beliefs, while remaining modest about their origins and attentive to the quiet feelings that sustain them. Part 9. The illusion of necessary connection. Far from academic debate, in the simplest scenes of life, we speak as if the world were bound together by invisible chains. A spark must ignite the fuel. A stone dropped from a height must fall. If someone lets go of a glass, we say it has to shatter when it hits the ground. This small word, this sense of must, carries an air of necessity, as though the future were locked in, advance by some inner power in things. Hume asks us to turn the microscope of attention onto this feeling of necessity. When we say that one event causes another, what exactly are we thinking? We are not just saying that the two events happen to occur together once. We seem to be saying that there is a stronger tie, a bond that could not be otherwise. Yet, when we look at experience carefully, what we actually see is more modest. Consider two billiard balls on a table. One moves, strikes the other, and the second begins to move, while the first slows or stops. At first glance, this looks like a clear case of causal power. But if we attend only to what appears to the senses, there is simply one motion followed by another. We see contact, succession and regularity. We never see a mysterious power flowing from one ball into the other. No matter how many times we repeat the observation, it is always the same one kind of event, then another kind of event. Perhaps then the impression of necessity comes from within. When you will your arm to rise, and it does, it can feel as if you are directly aware of an inner power producing an outer change. Yet here, too, Hume urges caution. We know from experience that our control is limited. We cannot will away a fever or lengthen our bodies by a thought. We do not understand how a mental decision is translated into muscular contraction, neural firing, and visible motion. What we actually experience is, again, a sequence, an intention, and then a movement. The power that bridges them, if there is such a power, never steps forward into view. Our command over our thoughts is no more revealing. You might decide to think of a childhood home and find that the image appears. At other times, you try to recall a name and fail, only for it to surface unbidden hours later. Here as well, what you observe is the succession and limitation of mental events, not an impression of a clear, intelligible power that guarantees them. We learn what we can and cannot do through repeated success and failure, not through a direct intuition of the mechanisms at work. Historically, some philosophers and theologians took a different road. Sensing that neither external bodies nor human minds revealed any necessary power, they placed it in a higher source. Created things, they suggested, have no real causal efficacy at all. They are merely occasions for a divine will that alone produces every change. When the billiard balls collide, it is not really the first that moves the second, but a hidden spirit that brings motion where and when it chooses. In this way, the felt necessity of causal connection is relocated into God. Hume's method here is steady and simple. Our genuine ideas, he reminds us, must be traceable back to impressions. If we have no impression of necessary power in bodies, and none in our own minds, what impression gives rise to the idea of divine power as the unique cause of everything? We can certainly form words and images, but when we test them against experience, they no longer carry a clear meaning. They float free of what we have actually seen and felt. This is where Hume's diagnosis takes shape. The impression that underlies our idea of necessity is not found in the objects themselves, nor in a special inner sense of power, but in the operation of custom on the mind. When we observe the same kinds of events constantly conjoined, our thoughts begin to flow from one to the other with ease. Over time, this flow takes on a feeling of inevitability. The mind, having become accustomed to a certain pattern, projects its own expectation outward and reads it back into the world as a quality of the objects. In other words, the necessity we think we see in fire and fuel, in stone and gravity, is in large part our own creation. It is the firmness of our expectation, solidified by countless repetitions, that we mistake for a power inhering in things. When we say that one event must follow another, we are often giving voice to the strength of our habit, not to a direct insight into some binding force that we have actually perceived. This does not mean that there are no regularities in nature. On the contrary, the whole story presupposes that the world does display stable patterns. Without them, custom could never form. Hume is not doubting that stones reliably fall or that heat regularly expands metal. What he is doubting is the extra layer of necessity. We are tempted to add the sense that we grasp, beyond the observed regularities, a kind of inner glue, a metaphysical bond that compels the effect to follow. We can feel the difference most sharply when our expectations are disturbed. Imagine flicking a light switch in a familiar room and nothing happens. For a moment, there is surprise, even a slight shock. Yet all that has occurred is a break in a regular sequence. Some part of you had silently taken the connection as fixed. When it fails, what is revealed is not a broken metaphysical chain, but the strength of your prior habit. The experience uncovers how deeply you had converted regularity into necessity. Modern science, with its talk of laws, can easily reinforce this tendency. Laws of nature are often spoken of as if they were edicts ordering events, so that the effect could not possibly fail to occur. But if we follow Hume's discipline, we can reinterpret this language. A law is a concise description of uniformities we have so far observed, perhaps broadened with careful theoretical speculation. It is a guide to expectations and predictions, not a visible chain binding the universe. When we loosen our grip on necessary connection in this way, the world takes on a slightly different aspect. It becomes a place of strong habits and stable patterns, but not of absolute guarantees. This shift can feel unsettling, because it removes a certain kind of philosophical security. Yet it also invites a more flexible attitude. We can acknowledge the incredible reliability of nature without claiming to see into its ultimate foundations. Hume's analysis leaves us in an interesting position. Custom gives rise to expectations. Those expectations, when steady and often confirmed, are felt as beliefs. And those firm beliefs, projected outward, are easily mistaken for necessary ties within the fabric of reality itself. Custom belief and the illusion of necessity are, thus, three layers of one process. By peeling them apart, we gain a clearer view of how the mind contributes to the order it experiences. To live with this insight is not to abandon talk of causes or to stop relying on the dependable course of things. It is to remember that behind the language of must, and cannot be otherwise, lies a more modest story, repeated observation, psychological propensity, and the mind's readiness to read its own habits into the world. With that awareness, we can still trust in patterns, yet hold our claims about their necessity with a quieter, more reflective hand. Part 10. The internal impression of power. Inwardly we often feel as though we grasp power itself, a spark of confidence when we flip a switch and expect the light, a sense that one thing must bring about another. Yet, if we follow Hume's method and ask, very patiently, what impression this idea of power is drawn from, the answer is less obvious than it first appears. We have already seen that, when we watch the world, we never perceive necessity itself. We see a constant pairing. The flame is followed by heat. The stone is followed by a splash. One type of event comes regularly after another, but in no single instance does the supposed must ever appear to the senses. Each case, taken alone, is perfectly loose and separate in our experience. After many repetitions, something in us changes. The sight of the first kind of event begins to call up the thought of the second, automatically, almost irresistibly. The mind does not stay where it is, it moves. It slides from one idea to the next. That silent slide is not something we infer by argument. We simply find it happening, again and again, whenever similar cases return. Hume's suggestion is that here, in this quiet inner movement, lies the real impression behind our grand talk of power and necessity. What we directly feel is not a mysterious tie in the objects, but a determination in ourselves, a felt transition from cause to effect in thought. A custom-made pathway the mind has worn into itself through repetition. Take a familiar example. You press the button on a kettle. Almost before you know it, you have pictured steam, tea, the warmth of a mug between your hands. If the kettle failed to heat, you would feel surprise, even a small shock. That surprise reveals what had been operating in the background, a settled expectation that the effect would follow. The necessity you believed in was, Hume says, this settled habit, this firmness of expectation, dressed up in metaphysical language. To capture this, he offers not one, but two ways of defining a cause. First, from the outside, a cause is an object that is regularly followed by another, where objects of the first type are constantly conjoined with objects of the second. Fire with heat, striking with a certain kind of sound. This describes the pattern we find in the world, the repeated pairing in experience. Second, from the inside, a cause is an object whose appearance carries the mind, by custom, to the idea of its usual follower, and produces in us a special sentiment of expectation. The cause is what not only precedes its effect in the world, but also stirs this internal impression of being determined to anticipate the effect. Here we are no longer describing what lies out there, but what it is like to be a mind confronted with regularities. Hume's full account of causation joins these two definitions. If we left out the external pattern, we would not be talking about causes at all, but about arbitrary associations or daydreams. If we left out the internal impression, we would have constant conjunctions without any sense of necessity. Only together do they match the impressions that actually accompany our ordinary idea of one thing making another happen. This move shifts the entire debate about causation. Philosophers before Hume tended to treat power and necessity as deep features of reality hidden behind what we see. They spoke of forces, essences, and inner springs of action. Hume turns the question around. Before claiming insight into hidden powers in nature, we must first ask whether we ever had an impression of such a thing at all. His answer is that we did not. What we genuinely find is a repeated sequence in experience and a corresponding habit in the mind. It might seem natural to object that, even if we do not see power in external objects, we at least feel it in ourselves. When you decide to raise your arm and it rises, does it not seem as though you grasp, from the inside, the power of willing? Hume carefully examines this feeling as well. He points out that we are, in fact, quite ignorant of how even our own body moves. We will a movement and a complex chain of nerves, muscles, and microscopic processes unfolds, most of which we never perceive. What we are aware of is again a constant conjunction, a certain mental event, the decision regularly followed by a bodily motion. Over time, the mind comes to expect the movement when the volition occurs. The same pattern appears. We do not discover a mysterious inner power of the will. We discover another habit of expectation, another internal determination, acquired through experience of our own behavior. By locating necessary connection in the mind's response, rather than in the bare perception of objects, Hume does not deny that the world has regular structure. On the contrary, without stable patterns, our habits could never form. What he denies is that we can legitimately project our feeling of determination back onto the objects as if we had inspected their inner nature and found a binding force there. Our idea of necessity is not a window into the secret depths of reality. It is a mirror reflecting how human psychology copes with repetition. This psychological turn has far-reaching consequences. When we claim that a cause must have its effect, that a miracle is impossible, or that a design in nature demands a designer, we are often leaning heavily on our sense that some sequences could not be otherwise. Hume's analysis reminds us that this sense is always rooted in habit, not in a special rational insight into necessity itself. The more familiar the sequence, the stronger the feeling, but the feeling alone does not license stronger claims about how the world must be. At the same time, he does not ask us to abandon these habits. He calls custom the great guide of life. The very same mechanism that produces the internal impression of power also makes learning possible, stabilizes our expectations, and allows us to navigate a world far too complex for explicit calculation. The point is not to escape habit, but to see it clearly for what it is. Once we recognize that our sense of power is an inward impression, we can hold our beliefs about causes more lightly. We can distinguish between the firmness of our expectation and the strength of the evidence that produced it. We can acknowledge that what feels necessary to us is, in the end, a product of how our nature has been shaped by experience. This humility about necessity prepares the way for Hume's equally modest view of reason in ethics, and opens onto a picture of human beings as creatures guided at every level by impressions and sentiments. Part 11, Reason, Passion and Motivation. Turning now from causation to conduct, Hume applies the same quiet discipline to our moral life. We like to imagine that, at our best, we are ruled by reason. We picture the virtuous person as someone who sees what is right and is moved simply by that insight to act. Behind this image stands a long tradition of moral rationalism which treats moral truths as something like mathematical theorems, discoverable and motivating through pure thought. Hume asks us to look more closely at what actually happens when we act, not what we praise in speeches, but what we can observe in ourselves. When we do, he thinks the picture of reason as a sovereign ruler quickly dissolves. Reason compares ideas, draws inferences, and uncovers connections. But the push, the impulse to move from thought to action, always comes from somewhere else. He begins from a simple observation. Philosophers and ordinary people alike speak of a conflict between reason and passion. We say that reason tells us one thing, passion pulls us toward another, and we ought to listen to reason. For this to be literally true, reason would have to be able to motivate on its own. It would need the power to stand up against a passion and move the will in a different direction. Hume's earlier analysis of reason gives him a way to test this. All reasoning, he says, falls into two broad kinds. First, there is demonstrative reasoning, which deals with relations between ideas, mathematics, logic, the comparison of concepts. Second, there is probable or causal reasoning, which concerns matters of fact, how one event is connected to another in the world. If reason by itself can motivate, we should find cases where either pure calculation or bare causal insight on their own produce action. Consider simple arithmetic. You might want to avoid debt. That desire can lead you to calculate your income and your expenses. You might discover, through careful mathematical reasoning, that you are about to overspend. But the reasoning did not generate the concern about debt. It merely showed you how to satisfy it. The motive comes from the desire. The sums only guide its expression. No one is moved to balance their budget merely because they have contemplated the beauty of the number system. The same is true, Hume argues, of causal reasoning. You may see clearly that regular exercise tends to promote health. You may understand in detail how diet affects long-term well-being. Yet if you feel no concern for your health, this knowledge lies inert. It maps out routes, but provides no reason by itself to walk any of them. You act only when some desire, perhaps for long life or for social approval or for immediate pleasure, hooks onto this causal map and uses it. From examples like these, Hume draws two connected conclusions. First, reason alone never originates a motive. It can inform, organize, and direct motives, but cannot create them. Second, if reason cannot produce motives, it cannot literally oppose a passion in the will. Only a motive can stand against a motive. Reason can show that a belief is false and thereby extinguish a passion built on illusion. It can reveal that a means will not achieve the end we care about, but it never, by its own force, pushes us to act. This is the background for his famous remark that reason is, and ought only to be, the servant of the passions. He is not celebrating irrational impulse. He is identifying a structural fact about human psychology. Our actions always flow from some felt concern, some inclination, some sentiment. Reason's role is to make these movements more coherent, more informed, less self-defeating. It serves by advising, not by commanding. Hume then turns this picture into an argument about the source of morality itself. When we approve of a generous act or condemn an act of cruelty, we are clearly not engaged in idle speculation. Moral judgments, he points out, have obvious practical effects. People feel guilt and shame. They feel pride and contentment. They change their behavior because they think something is right or wrong, just or unjust. So we have two premises. First, moral concepts are deeply motivating. They stir our passions, shape our self-image, and guide our choices. Second, reason by itself, as we have just seen, is incapable of stirring passions or initiating action. From this, Hume infers that moral concepts cannot arise from reason alone. If they were simply a set of relations grasped by the intellect, they would be as motivationally inert as geometry. Where then do they come from? Hume reminds us of his basic framework. Every mental item we are aware of is either an idea or an impression. Ideas are faint copies of earlier, livelier experiences. Impressions are the vivid presentations of sensation and feeling. To approve or disapprove, to praise or blame, to feel esteem or contempt, these, he says, are clearly impressions. They are modes of feeling. So if morality engages us, if it moves us, it must draw its life from sentiment. This does not mean that morality is a chaotic swirl of private likes and dislikes. Nor does it make reason irrelevant. Rather, Hume is beginning to sketch a picture where reason helps us gather and arrange the facts, see the effects of character traits, and anticipate outcomes. And then a more fundamental layer of our nature responds with approval or disapproval. The deeper response, he thinks, is rooted in our capacity to sympathize with others and to take up a shared point of view. Some of Hume's contemporaries, such as Francis Hutcheson, had already spoken of a special moral sense, an extra God-given faculty that lets us detect virtue in others and feel a distinctive pleasure in it. Hume is sympathetic to the idea that morality is founded in feeling, but uneasy with mysterious new senses and divine implants. His overall project is to naturalize our mental life, explaining as much as possible through familiar mechanisms. So he rejects the thought that we need a special, original moral sense to account for virtue. Instead, he will argue the very same principles that explain causal belief, association, habit, and the transmission of vivacity also explain how we come to share moral sentiments. Sympathy, in his technical sense, will bridge the gap between our own feelings and those of others. From there, a stable, public standpoint will emerge from which we call some traits virtues and others vices. For now, it is enough to notice the stance he invites us to take toward ourselves. When you feel the force of an ought, ask what in you is being moved. Beneath the reasons you can state, there will always be some concern, some care, some sentiment that gives those reasons weight. Seeing this clearly need not undermine morality. It can instead humanize it, reminding us that our ethical life is not the operation of a cold faculty, but the organized expression of our nature as feeling beings. Part 12. Sympathy and the general point of view. From here Hume turns to his constructive moral psychology. If morality is rooted in sentiment rather than pure reason, we need to understand how those sentiments arise and why they display the patterns they do. Why do we tend to admire courage, honesty, and kindness? Why do we disapprove of cruelty and treachery? And why, despite our different situations, is there so much overlap in human moral judgment? Hume begins by examining what it is like to morally evaluate someone. When we contemplate a person's character, we often feel a calm, steady approval. We find them admirable, lovable, worthy of trust. Or we feel an equally calm but firm disapproval, a tendency to shrink away in dislike or contempt. These are not explosive passions. They are more like tones that colour our view. When the object of evaluation is ourselves, these same sentiments appear as pride and humility. He calls these feelings the moral sentiments. They are pleasant or painful impressions that arise when we reflect on traits of character and their usual effects. To explain them, he does not appeal to a special moral faculty. Instead, he invokes a mechanism he has already used to explain our social life, more generally sympathy. In Hume's technical vocabulary, sympathy is not a feeling of pity. It is a psychological process by which we come to share in the feelings of others. The structure of this process is simple but powerful. First, we form an idea of what someone else is experiencing. We hear their story, see their situation, or read their expression, and we arrive at a faint conception of their joy, their grief, their anger. Second, we notice the resemblances between us and them as fellow human beings, as members of the same family, culture, or age group. We may also be linked by contiguity in space and time, or by causal relations such as friendship and dependence. According to Hume, these associative ties matter. The stronger the resemblance, closeness, or connection, the more easily our mind moves from the bare idea of another's feeling to something livelier. This is the third step, our ever-present awareness of ourselves, which is always vivid, lends some of its force to the idea of the other's emotion. The mind's laws of association do not merely connect ideas, they transmit intensity from one to another. When enough force is transmitted, something remarkable happens. The faint idea of another's emotion becomes an impression in us. If my friend suffers a devastating loss, I first form an idea of her grief. My constant sense of myself, combined with our resemblance and closeness, transfers vivacity to this idea. It gradually grows so lively that it becomes, for me, a genuine feeling of sadness. I now literally share, though perhaps more weakly, in her passion. Hume emphasizes that this same structure underlies both belief and sympathy. In causal inference, we move from an impression of smoke to the idea of fire, and the associative principles enliven that idea until it approaches the force of an impression. The result is belief that fire is present. In sympathy, we move from an idea of another's passion to an actual impression of a similar passion in ourselves. In both cases, association and the transmission of vivacity transform faint ideas into psychologically potent states. With sympathy in place, Hume can offer a first sketch of moral evaluation. We observe someone's character traits and their usual effects on themselves and on others. Through sympathy, we come to share in the pleasures and pains those traits tend to produce. When the overall balance, as it spreads through the network of people around the agent, is agreeable, we feel a calm love or esteem. When it is on balance disagreeable, we feel a calm hatred or contempt. These are the moral sentiments of approval and disapproval. But there are difficulties. Left to itself, sympathy is uneven. We sympathize more strongly with those who are close to us in space, time, resemblance, or relationship. A minor misfortune befalling a friend can move us more than a great tragedy in a distant land. If the moral sentiments simply mirrored this raw pattern, our approvals and disapprovals would be wildly variable and parochial. Moreover, sympathy tracks actual effects, but our moral judgments often seem to reach beyond them. We admire, for example, a person of integrity whose circumstances never gave them the chance to perform great public services. Their virtue is, as Hume puts it, in rags. It has not had the usual happy consequences, yet we still feel a steady approval when we contemplate their character. Our moral sentiment seems to respond to something more stable than the accidents of fortune. To meet these challenges, Hume introduces the idea of the general point of view. Under ordinary, uncorrected sympathy, our feelings follow the shifting contours of our personal connections. The general point of view is a standpoint we learn to adopt when we want to judge character in a way that others can share. It is not a mysterious faculty, but a disciplined use of our ordinary mechanisms. This standpoint has two main features. First, we choose to consider a person's traits from the perspective of that person and of their usual associates, family, friends, neighbours, co-workers. We ask how the trait tends, in general, to affect the well-being of those who regularly interact with the agent. We do not simply ask how it affects us here and now. We step back and look at the circle that naturally surrounds each individual. Second, we regulate our sympathy by relying on general rules about the typical effects of traits, rather than on the particular, perhaps exceptional, outcomes in a given case. Someone may be honest yet unlucky, so that their honesty never brings them prosperity or praise. Another may be selfish yet fortunate, so that their vice is never fully exposed. When we take up the general point of view, we bracket these accidents and focus on what honesty and selfishness usually bring about in human life. By combining these two corrections, we arrive at a perspective that is, in principle, the same for all observers. From this shared standpoint, we feel approval for traits that are, as a rule, useful or immediately agreeable either to the person who has them or to others around them. We feel disapproval for traits that are, in general, harmful or immediately disagreeable. The moral sentiments on this view are not raw, shifting sympathies, but refined, regulated responses from a common human vantage point. This framework allows Hume to offer a broad classification of virtues. Some traits, like industry and prudence, are primarily useful to the person who has them. Others, like generosity and justice, are principally useful to others. Some qualities, such as cheerfulness or wit, are immediately agreeable to their possessor. Still others, like good manners or a warm disposition, are immediately agreeable to those who encounter them. All of these, in different ways, attract our moral approval when surveyed from the general point of view. The same framework also underlies Hume's quiet challenges to inherited religious moralities. Traits traditionally praised as virtues, such as extreme self-denial, constant fasting, or withdrawal from human society, do not fare well when judged by their usefulness or agreeableness to anyone. By contrast, qualities like reasonable pride in one's achievements or enjoyment of life, often treated with suspicion in religious traditions, emerge as natural objects of approval. The measure of virtue becomes human, life as it is actually lived, not an imagined otherworldly standard. Finally, Hume dissolves the sharp boundary many of his contemporaries drew between moral virtues and natural talents. Whether we are considering honesty or a quick understanding, courage or a fine memory, the same sympathetic mechanism and the same general point of view explain our approval. Both sets of traits affect the happiness of the agent and others. Both, when contemplated from the shared standpoint, evoke similar, calm sentiments of esteem. In the end, his account identifies what has moral value with features of our psychology. First, order passions and affections, and the actions that express them are the things that can be good or bad. Second, order reflective sentiments, our feelings of approval and disapproval when we survey those passions are what confer moral status. Morality is, on this view, not something imposed from outside human nature. It is a pattern that arises within it from the interplay of sympathy, habit, and a gradually learned willingness to see ourselves and others from a common point of view. Seen in this light, Hume's sentimentalism is not a denial of objectivity, but a relocation of it. The moral point of view is not a divine throne or a realm of abstract forms. It is the standpoint any of us can inhabit when we widen our sympathy beyond our private circle and attend to the general tendencies of human character. From there, morality appears as something both fragile and robust. Fragile because it depends on our capacity for feeling; robust because that capacity is woven deep into the way our minds, as natural beings, are built. Part 13. Benevolence vis self-love. Amid the small dramas of ordinary life, we often feel pulled in two directions. One current runs inward toward comfort, safety, and advantage. Another reaches outward toward friends, children, strangers in need. When we help praise or sacrifice, are we ever truly moved by concern for others? Or is every impulse, once we look closely enough, just self-love wearing a mask? Hume enters this old dispute with a characteristically quiet question. Instead of beginning with abstract claims about human nature, he asks us to look at what actually appears in our experience. What does it feel like to approve of a generous action? What is it like, from the inside, to grieve, to admire, to resent? And do these feelings really reduce to calculations of private gain? Many of Hume's contemporaries thought the answer was yes. They argued that beneath every motive lies the desire for one's own happiness. We praise benevolence, charity, and friendship, they said, only because in the long run these things serve our interest. What looks like kindness is, in truth, a more clever form of selfishness. Hume thinks this picture is too flat. It does not fit the impressions we actually find in ourselves. To see why, he begins not with theory, but with the pattern of our approvals and disapprovals. Imagine hearing of a generous reformer from centuries ago. Their efforts improved the lives of people long dead. In a country you will never visit, you feel a warm glow of admiration. You may even feel moved, inspired, quietly elevated by the story. Yet this person cannot help or harm you. They can neither advance your career nor threaten your security. If your moral approval always traced back to self-interest, these distant figures should leave you cold. Or consider the respect we sometimes feel for an honourable rival, a competitor in work, a political opponent, an intellectual adversary. Their success may come at our expense, and yet, when they act with integrity or courage, we can find ourselves grudgingly impressed. A part of us says, almost against our will, "That was well done." Push the point further. Think of the characters that move us in novels and films. They are not real. They hold no power over our fortunes. And yet we admire their loyalty, condemn their treachery, resent their cruelty, rejoice in their kindness. Our sentiments track traits that are useful or agreeable to others, even when our own interest is not at stake at all. Here Hume draws the conclusion: our approvals do not arise from silent calculations of advantage to ourselves. They flow through sympathy. We are constituted so that the happiness and misery of others can echo faintly within us. Their fortune becomes, in imagination, a little bit our own. The benefits of a generous character spread through a community, and we feel that spread as if we were participants in it. Sympathy for Hume is not noble or mystical. It is a natural mechanism of the mind, as basic as habit. We see a smile and tend to feel lighter. We hear a tone of grief and find our own chest tighten. Stories of flourishing or ruin awaken corresponding movements in us. Moral approval is the reflective form of this resonance. This explains why our moral feelings can be so wide-ranging. We can evaluate anyone at any time or place, provided we can imagine their situation. We can condemn tyrants who lived 2,000 years ago. We can admire anonymous heroes whose names history has lost. We can judge fictional characters who never existed. Our sentiments reach them because our imagination and sympathy do, not because they touch our personal interest. So much for how we judge. What about how we act? Here Hume meets an even stronger claim that every genuine motive, every desire that moves us, is finally a form of self-love. Even when we seem to care about others, the story goes, we are really aiming at our own satisfaction. Hume again invites us to look more closely at what happens within. A close friend dies. Their presence in your life was demanding. They needed help, money, constant attention. Their absence frees your schedule, lightens your responsibilities, perhaps even improves your prospects. Yet you grieve. The pain is real, heavy, unbidden. It is not the dull regret of losing an investment. It is the sharp ache of losing a person. If self-interest were the root of all desire, why is the emotion not one of secret relief alone? Or think of a parent who stays up through the night with a sick child. The costs are obvious: lost sleep, frayed nerves, disrupted work. The parent may gain no reputation for this, may never be thanked, may even be taken for granted. Yet there is no sense, from the inside, that they are calculating advantages. They are pulled by an affection that is immediate, almost instinctive. The child's welfare is felt as an end in itself. We see similar patterns beyond our species. Animals care for their young, risk themselves for members of their group, show distress at others suffering. To insist that all such reactions are unconscious, deductions from self-interest, is to smooth over rich, varied impressions with a single theoretical brush. Hume does not deny that self-love exists. Of course we care about our own happiness. We seek pleasure, avoid pain, plan for security. But he argues that self-love is one principle among others in human nature. Beside it stand particular passions: hunger, curiosity, love of children, desire for company, resentment of injury, gratitude for kindness. Among these is benevolence, a genuine tendency to find another's good desirable for its own sake. Here Hume leans on a subtle insight he borrows from Bishop Butler. The pleasures of life, Butler notes, come from satisfying particular desires. Food pleases because we are hungry. Honor pleases because we care about esteem. Knowledge pleases because we are curious. If we had no specific desires at all, if we wanted only happiness, in the abstract, there would be nothing from which happiness could be made. Self-love, then, is not a rival to every other affection. It is a higher-level concern that we do well overall. It depends on more basic motives. We cannot enjoy our own happiness unless we first care about things in the world, about projects, about people, about goals that reach beyond our own inner state. To reduce every particular desire to self-love is to confuse the structure of the mind. Think, for example, of someone who takes joy in their friend's success. There is a pleasure here, certainly. Self-love can approve of that pleasure, can be glad that life contains it. But the immediate desire is directed outward. It is the friend's flourishing that draws the heart. If that were not so, if the friend's good meant nothing in itself, there would be no joy to approve. Hume's claim is not that we are saints. Our benevolence is limited and partial. We care more about ourselves than about strangers, more about family than about the distant anonymous many. Yet within these limits, he insists other regarding motives are real. To deny them is not to be hard-headed. It is to ignore what, with a bit of attention, we can observe in our own sentiments. There is a further, quieter implication. If moral approval is rooted in sympathy, and if genuine benevolence exists alongside self-love, then ethics is not the cold application of a private calculus. It is the cultivation of our capacity to feel with others. We become better judges, and often better people, by widening the circle of those whose happiness and suffering we can vividly imagine. You can test this in yourself. Notice the difference between two inner voices. One asks, "What do I get from this?" The other asks, "What happens to them?" Both are natural. Both belong to you. Hume's point is that the second is not a disguised version of the first. It has its own tone, its own direction, its own place in the landscape of the mind. As we move forward to questions of justice and religion, this matters. Hume's picture of human nature is not one of pure generosity, but neither is it a machine of hidden greed. We are creatures of mixed motives, guided by habit, reason, and sentiment, and held together by the delicate thread of sympathy. Any philosophy that forgets this richness, that tries to explain everything from a single impulse, does violence to the very experience it claims to describe. Part 14. The artificial virtue of justice. Beyond the warmth of family and the give and take of friendship lies another moral terrain. It is the world of property lines, contracts, promises, and laws. Here praise and blame attach not only to feelings of kindness or cruelty, but to something more austere, keeping one's word, respecting boundaries, following rules. Hume calls the virtue that governs this domain justice, and he insists it is of a special kind. To understand what he means, it helps to distinguish two ways in which a trait can be rooted in human life. Some virtues seem to grow almost spontaneously out of our natural sentiments. Even in very small, simple groups, we find parental love, gratitude for kindness, pity for suffering, delight in companionship. These Hume calls natural virtues. They would appear in some form even if there were no elaborate social arrangements, no courts, no written laws. Other virtues depend on practices that only emerge when many individuals, with conflicting interests and limited generosity, must find ways to live together. These are artificial virtues, not because they are fake or insincere, but because they arise from human artifice, from rules and conventions slowly worked out over time. Justice is Hume's central example. Imagine a world without stable rules of property. Goods are scarce and easily moved. People care deeply for themselves and those close to them, and care much less for distant strangers. In such conditions, the temptation is obvious. Why not take from those you barely know to secure the comfort of those you love? The result, Hume thinks, would be a constant low-level conflict, maybe not open war, but endless suspicion and intermittent violence. Even if each individual act of taking seems locally beneficial, the overall pattern undermines everyone's security. Cooperation falters. Long-term projects become too risky. The advantages of living together in society begin to evaporate. Justice in Hume's sense is a collective response to this problem. We invent, or more accurately, we slide into a set of rules that specify who has a right to what. These rules of property, once established, are recognized and reinforced by custom and mutual expectation. This is mine, that is yours. I will keep my hands off what belongs to you, and you will keep your hands off what belongs to me. Notice the structure here. No single act of restraint fully explains the value of justice. The point is the practice. A world in which almost everyone usually respects property is far more stable and productive than a world in which people constantly seize what they can. The rules of justice are like the rules of a game. Each move only makes sense within the system as a whole. From rules of property, further conventions unfold. Once there are possessions, there must be ways to transfer them, to give, sell, inherit, or exchange. Out of this grows the practice of promising and contracting, of binding oneself by words to future actions. In time, when the web becomes too complex to manage by informal expectations alone, forms of government arise to stabilize and enforce these arrangements. For Hume, this sequence is not planned in advance by a wise lawgiver. It is the slow product of human beings responding to recurring pressures. We are, by nature, limited cooperators. We have enough concern for others to live in small families and tribes, but not enough to sustain large-scale sharing of resources. Conventions of justice bridge this gap. They allow a society of mostly self-interested and partially benevolent creatures to enjoy the benefits of order. If this is what justice is, two questions follow. First, what moves us to create and maintain these rules? Second, why do we morally approve of those who obey them? Hume's answer to the first question leans heavily on interest. Individuals gradually notice that life, under a stable practice of justice, is better for almost everyone than life without it. Property rules, promise, keeping, and the authority of law make possible commerce, long-term planning, and a degree of peace. Even those who are not especially generous can see that their own safety and prosperity depend on these arrangements. It is therefore in our collective interest to establish and maintain them. But when we turn to moral approval, Hume refuses to reduce everything to self-love. We do not praise a just person merely because their honesty happens, at the moment, to protect our wallet. Often strict justice is inconvenient for us. We may be frustrated that a contract binds us, or that another's legal claim thwarts our advantage. Still, from a calmer, more general point of view, we admire the person who keeps their word, who returns what is entrusted, who respects agreements even when temptation presses in the other direction. Why? Again Hume invokes sympathy. We see, or easily imagine, the widespread benefits of a society where such people are common. This includes the security, the trust, and the flourishing of projects that depend on reliable cooperation. Our approval tracks these shared advantages, not just our own momentary gain. There is, however, a tension built into this picture. While it is in our interest to live under a practice of justice, it may not always be in our interest to obey its rules in every particular case. Here Hume introduces the disturbing figure of the sensible knave. The sensible knave understands the value of justice in general. He wants the practice firmly in place. He wants others to follow the rules. But he also notices something else. His own single act of injustice, breaking a promise when no one will find out, embezzling a sum that will never be traced, will not topple the system. The practice of justice is sustained by the obedience of the many. One discrete violation will leave the institution intact while bringing him a large private advantage. From a narrow point of view, the knave's reasoning seems hard to shake. If you could lie, cheat, or steal just once, with certainty of never being caught, and gain enormously, why not? Hume admits that purely prudential arguments may fail to move such a person. Appeals to long-term interest, reputation, or inner peace all presuppose the knave is uncertain, risking exposure or self-contempt. But what if he is confident and cold? Hume's response here is strikingly modest. He suggests that a character willing to take advantage in this way has, by that very willingness, moved outside the common moral world. There is something mean, something small in a person who will pocket a private gain by secretly breaking the very rules that secure the peace and trust he enjoys. To live with others on such terms is to forfeit a certain kind of fellowship. This is not quite a knockdown argument. Hume himself hints that no strictly rational proof will fully answer the knave. Instead, the distance emerges at the level of sentiment and character. Most of us, shaped by sympathy and habit, feel a quiet repugnance at the thought of such underhanded advantage. We want not only to live in a just society, but to be, or at least to see ourselves as, just persons. Justice, then, reveals one of Hume's central themes. Our moral life is sustained less by abstract demonstration than by shared feelings, customs, and the subtle education of the passions. We have learned, from childhood, to resent injury, to admire fair dealing, to feel shame at treachery. These sentiments make the practice of justice stable. Without them, rules would be fragile things, always at the mercy of the sensible knave. You can see this in modern life as well. Consider paying taxes when you could easily evade a portion, sharing credit for a project when you could quietly claim more, honouring the terms of a subscription license or fare when you could slip through unseen. The systems around you work only because most people, most of the time, follow the rules they could in principle break. From the point of view of bare advantage, the temptation to free ride is always present. From the point of view of a shared moral world, the temptation appears differently. It looks shabby, parasitic, a small breach in a fabric you also rely on. Whether we resist or give in depends, in Hume's eyes, less on theoretical argument than on the cast of our character and the depth of our identification with others. Calling justice an artificial virtue is therefore not an insult. It is a recognition that some of the most important features of our moral life are built slowly, collectively, and precariously out of human interactions. They depend on the mind's natural tendencies to form habits, to feel with others, to seek stability in the midst of scarcity and partiality. To understand justice is to see, once again, how a limited and sympathetic creature like us creates a world of rules and then lives inside the very order it has devised. Part 15. The Argument from Design. Inside a quiet night sky, it is easy to feel that something more than blind chance is at work. Stars trace their ancient patterns. Seasons return with reassuring regularity. Living things show an intricate fit between form and environment. From this sense of order, many have drawn a familiar conclusion. Where there is design, there must be a designer. Hume's dialogues concerning natural religion enter this atmosphere of wonder and inference. But instead of one authoritative voice, they offer a conversation among three figures, each embodying a different way of thinking about God and the universe. Cleanthes is the confident defender of the argument from design. He calls himself an experimental theist. By this he means that theology should proceed, as the new science does, by careful observation, cautious generalization, and reasoning from experience. We see order, regularity, and purpose in the natural world. We know from our own experience that similar patterns in human life, machines, buildings, plans, come from intelligent minds. Why not conclude by analogy that the universe too is the product of a mind, a divine architect, vastly superior to us, but still recognizably like a rational being? Demeter stands at the opposite pole. For him, God's essence is beyond all human comprehension. The attempt to know the divine nature from the finite world is not just presumptuous, it is doomed. Whatever God may be, he is infinitely unlike us. To infer his attributes from created things is to drag the incomprehensible down to our level. If we reason about God at all, Demeter prefers the old a priori arguments, claims that from the sheer idea of a necessary being we can demonstrate that something like God must exist. Between them stands Philo, the skeptic. He is not a flamboyant denier of everything. Rather, he practices the mitigated skepticism that Hume recommends elsewhere. A constant awareness of the limits of human reason, combined with a readiness to follow experience where it genuinely leads. Philo doubts that our finite minds can support the confident steps that both Clinthas and Demea wish to take, whether through probability or through pure demonstration. As the dialogues begin, an important agreement is in place. All three characters set aside the question of whether God exists. They will not rehearse arguments for and against the bare fact of a deity. Instead, they focus on a narrower and subtler issue. What can we legitimately infer about God's nature from the world we experience? Clinthas believes that the argument from design provides a powerful, if not mathematically certain, answer. Look at the universe, he says, as a whole. Its parts are intricately adjusted to one another. Natural laws operate with regularity. Living organisms exhibit complex structures suited to their survival. This pattern, taken together, resembles the effect of a grand machine. When we find a watch in a field, we do not attribute its structure to wind and rain. We infer a watchmaker. By the same reasoning, only vastly magnified, we should infer a divine maker of the world. This way of thinking feels natural. Our everyday experience trains us to read intention into order. A neatly arranged room suggests a tidying hand. A sequence of organized sounds suggests a deliberate composition. We are quick to project a mind whenever we see structure and apparent purpose. Clinthas's argument takes this familiar habit and extends it to the whole cosmos. In doing so, he aligns theology with the temper of his age. The 18th century revered the successes of experimental science. Astronomers had traced planetary motions with striking accuracy. Physicists described the behavior of bodies in mathematical laws. Naturalists catalogued the adaptations of plants and animals. Many saw in these discoveries not a threat to faith, but a new foundation for it. Instead of relying on abstract proofs, they would point to the universe itself as the evidence of divine wisdom and power. Hume understands the psychological force of this move. The design argument does not demand one vast leap, but many small ones. We move from familiar cases, the house and the architect, the ship and the shipbuilder, to the unfamiliar case of the universe and its cause. The mind, following custom, glides along the chain of resemblances. The conclusion feels less like a new idea than like the natural extension of a pattern we already trust. Yet for that very reason, Hume is alert to the dangers hidden in the movement. All analogy rests on both similarity and difference. The world is not a watch, the universe is not a house. However tempting the comparison, the distance between the human scale and the cosmic scale is enormous. Philo will later press this point, asking how far our tiny sample of experience can license claims about an infinite or eternal cause. Demea's objection, meanwhile, strikes in a different direction. For him, Clinthas's God is too human, too bounded by our own concepts. To model the divine mind on the human mind, even with the disclaimer that it is infinitely greater, is to forget God's transcendence. A deity whose existence is only probable, whose attributes are inferred from analogy, seems unworthy of worship. Better, Demea thinks, to hold that God is necessary, incomprehensible, and known only in outline through reason's most abstract efforts. Hume uses this clash to reveal a deeper tension in religious thought. On the one hand, believers want a God who is not wholly alien, a being with whom one can stand in some relation of understanding, trust, and perhaps love. On the other hand, they also want a God who surpasses human concepts, who is not confined by the limitations of our imagination. The argument from design pushes toward the first image, a supremely wise engineer. Traditional metaphysics pushes toward the second, a wholly other necessary being. Through Philo, Hume gently exposes the cost of each path. If we lean hard on design, we risk shrinking God down to our scale. Our own notions of intelligence, goodness, and purpose become the template. But our notions are drawn from a very small corner of reality, and from a very flawed species. If we lean hard on incomprehensibility, we risk emptying our words about God of clear content. Beyond a certain point, to say that God is infinitely wise or good. While insisting that we have no idea what wisdom or goodness could mean in this context is to utter sounds rather than to convey ideas. The dialogues do not resolve this tension quickly. They allow Cleanthus to make the design argument as strongly and persuasively as possible. They allow Demea to defend divine mystery with pious intensity, and they allow Philo, step by cautious step, to question how much either side can really claim to know. From the standpoint of Hume's wider philosophy, the argument from design is especially revealing. It shows our natural impulse to project our own mental life onto the world. Just as we infer hidden forces from repeated patterns of events, we infer a hidden mind from the order we find in nature. In both cases, habit and imagination play a central role. This does not mean for Hume that belief in a designer is irrational in the everyday sense. It means rather that such belief, like many of our beliefs, rests on analogies and expectations that go beyond what strict reason can guarantee. The same faculties that lead us to trust induction, to expect the sun to rise and bread to nourish, also make the design argument feel compelling. The question the dialogues probe is how far this resemblance can carry us when the subject is the ultimate origin of all things. As we move further into Hume's treatment of religion, into issues of anthropomorphism, infinity, and evil, the simple, reassuring force of the design argument will be tested. But at this early stage, we are invited to linger with its initial appeal, to feel, honestly, the pull of that night sky, to acknowledge how readily the mind, faced with a vast and ordered scene, whispers to itself somewhere, in some manner, there must be a mind behind this. For Hume, philosophy begins not by silencing such whispers, but by listening to them carefully. What exactly are we inferring? From which experiences do our ideas of design and designer arise? And how far can these ideas stretch before they lose their anchor in the impressions from which they sprang? The argument from design, set in this light, becomes less a final proof and more a window into the workings of our own thinking. A case study in how the human mind, limited yet imaginative, reaches out toward what it can hardly hope to grasp. Part 16. Anthropomorphism and Infinity. At first, the idea of God seems simple enough. We reach for the most impressive thing we know, the human mind, and then we enlarge it. Imagine a mind that knows more, plans better, sees further, cares deeper. A mind without our weaknesses or limits. This, for many, is what it means to say that God is a person. Hume invites us to look more carefully at what we have just done. We have taken a familiar impression, our own inner life, and stretched it. We imagine the divine as a kind of magnified version of ourselves. This is anthropomorphism, the habit of seeing the divine in our own image. It is natural, even inevitable, for creatures who only ever encounter human minds from the inside. But theology, especially the classical traditions of the West, wants more than this. God is not only like us. God, we are told, is infinite, boundless in power, knowledge, goodness, without parts, without change, without any of the limitations and fragments that define human life. Here a deep tension opens. A God who is very much like us is accessible, intelligible, and emotionally satisfying. A God who is truly infinite begins to slip out of view. Hume's method is to ask what impressions does each of these ideas come from. When we talk about a mind, we have impressions to draw on. We know what it is to plan, to think, to feel joy or anger or love. When we talk about a powerful or wise mind, we intensify impressions we already possess. Someone who can solve harder problems, foresee more consequences, resist more temptation. All of this has some footing in experience. Infinity does not. We never encounter an infinite object. We can imagine longer and longer lines, larger and larger collections, more and more knowledge. But we never meet an actual boundless quantity in experience. Our idea of the infinite is not a rich, positive picture. It is more like a negation. Not this amount, not that amount, no limit. Hume suspects that when we use the word infinite, we are more often gesturing than describing. Now place these two tendencies side by side. On one hand, we want a God whose attributes we can actually think with. Power, knowledge, goodness, will, intention. These all sound like the features of a person. On the other hand, we want a God who surpasses all limits and comparisons, a being to whom none of our familiar words truly apply. We slide back and forth between these poles without always noticing it. The design argument, which Hume explores in his dialogues, leans heavily on anthropomorphism. The universe, it is said, resembles a machine. It displays order, adjustment of parts to ends, something like craftsmanship. From an orderly effect, we infer an intelligent cause. The world is to God as a watch is to a watchmaker. The conclusion seems straightforward. God is a kind of mind, similar to ours, only greater in degree. Hume probes the structure of this analogy. We understand machines, and we understand the minds that make them, because we see the two constantly joined in experience. The watch and the watchmaker, the house and the builder, we move from one to the other on the basis of repeated observation. But we have never observed a universe being made. We have no stock of impressions linking worlds to world makers. The analogy hangs in empty space. There is also a question of proportion. If we make the world like a human artifact, then the cause of the world must be like a human craftsman. But how far does this likeness go? Does the cause have one mind or many? Is it wise but morally indifferent? Is it skilled only in one domain? We know dozens of different kinds of artisans. Why assume a single, perfect architect rather than a committee, or a succession of attempts and failures? As we press the analogy, its apparent clarity dissolves into a swarm of competing stories. Suppose, though, that we set these complications aside and accept the basic move. The world looks like it was designed, so there must be a designer. If we then insist that this designer is infinite, the ground shifts under our feet. An infinite mind, infinite wisdom, infinite power. These words sound impressive, but do we still know what we are talking about? Our impressions reach as far as human minds, human understanding, human skill. When we lift the limit, we also loosen the connection to anything we have actually experienced. Hume's copy principle becomes a quiet test here. Take the idea of an infinitely wise mind. Strip away the word infinite, and you are left with the idea of a wise human being drawn from experience. Now add, without any limit. What has changed in your actual thought? Do you now possess a new, more detailed image? Or have you simply attached a sign that says, and more, indefinitely, to an old idea? Hume's suspicion is that, in most cases, we are only repeating a word. Anthropomorphism and infinity then generate a dilemma. If we keep the human analogy strong, if we really mean that God is a mind like ours, we gain content, but we lose divinity. The deity begins to look like a very impressive creature among others, powerful and knowledgeable, but still in some sense one more being in the universe. If we elevate God beyond all comparison, insisting that none of our concepts apply, we may preserve transcendence, but we pay with intelligibility. Our religious language floats free from experience. We no longer know what our own sentences mean. Hume dramatizes this through characters who talk past one another. One insists that to preserve faith, we must speak of God as utterly incomprehensible. Another insists that without some clear, humanly intelligible content, the word God becomes indistinguishable from an empty sound. Each criticizes the other's position, without noticing how their own view is pulled toward the same difficulty. The psychological roots of anthropomorphism deepen the problem. We experience other people as centers of intention and feeling. When we are moved by awe, fear, or gratitude toward the world as a whole, it is natural to direct those feelings toward a cosmic person. A mind behind the storm, behind the harvest, behind the run of our own fortunes. This gives our emotions an object and our prayers a direction. It knits our inner life into a story. Yet the very features that make a personal, God emotionally powerful, also make the idea philosophically fragile. Persons are partial, situated, changing. They respond, reconsider, choose between alternatives. A God like this cannot easily be the infinite, simple, unchanging being of traditional theology. Anthropomorphism tugs us toward a vivid but limited deity, a kind of supernatural agent among others. Infinity tugs us toward something more like an abstract principle beyond mind as we know it. The two pictures resist fusion. Hume is not merely scoring points against religious belief. He is exercising the discipline he recommends at the very start of his philosophy. Trace your ideas to their impressions and ask how far those impressions reach. When we do this with our idea of God, we find that our clearest, materials are borrowed from human life. Power, knowledge, goodness, intention. The more we magnify and abstract these, the more our grasp weakens, until our language no longer returns to any concrete experience. This does not, by itself, refute the existence of a divine reality. Hume is more modest. He suggests that natural theology, the project of discovering God's nature by reason alone from the study of the world, overestimates what our concepts can bear. It tells us that God must be both like us and utterly unlike us, both a mind and something beyond mind, both described by our words and beyond all description. When we follow these claims back to their sources, we find tangled habits of thought rather than clear, grounded ideas. Anthropomorphism and infinity thus mark two boundaries of our imagination. On one side, our urge to see ourselves in the sky. On the other, our longing for something that exceeds every human measure. Hume does not command us to choose between them. He simply holds up a mirror and asks us to notice how far each can be made coherent. In that reflective space, the confident outlines of traditional natural theology begin to blur. The stage is set for a further question. If we are already uncertain about what kind of being God could be, what happens when we face the world's suffering and ask whether this being is good? Part 17. The problem of evil and divine indifference. In turning from God's nature to the state of the world, the discussion becomes more personal. Anthropomorphism and infinity may feel like distant puzzles, but pain, loss, and fear do not. They press directly on experience. It is here, in the facts of suffering, that Hume's critique of natural theology takes on its sharpest edge. The problem of evil begins from a simple tension. On the one hand, many theistic traditions affirm a God who is all-powerful, all-knowing, and perfectly good. On the other hand, the world we observe is filled with disease, natural disaster, cruelty, and grief. If God knows about every instance of suffering, has the power to prevent it, and is perfectly benevolent, why does any of it occur? People rarely come to religion by way of this abstract question. Hume is sensitive to a more immediate starting point. Human beings are vulnerable, finite creatures, acutely aware, at least at certain moments, of our dependence on forces we cannot control. Illness, poverty, war, the death of those we love, these can stir in us a sense of helplessness that looks outward for protection or meaning. Religion often begins here, in fear and need, before it becomes a system of doctrines. When we try to reconcile this emotional starting point with a philosophical picture of God, we reach for explanations that might justify suffering. Perhaps pain is a necessary contrast for pleasure. Perhaps hardship builds character. Perhaps the trials of this life are compensated in another. These attempts to defend God's goodness in the face of suffering are what later thinkers called theodicies. Hume takes these stories seriously enough to press them. Each, he notes, rests on claims that far outrun what experience can support. To say that every specific agony serves a greater good is to pretend a view of the whole structure of reality that no human being possesses. We cannot even see all the consequences of our own actions, much less trace each earthquake, famine, or act of cruelty into an invisible, redemptive plan. Even if such plans were possible, the logic of the problem of evil remains. Think Hume suggests in very simple terms. If a being is unlimited in power, it could have arranged the world in any way not strictly impossible. If it is unlimited in knowledge, it would foresee all outcomes of any arrangement. If it is perfectly benevolent, it would prefer states of affairs with less suffering, other things being equal. In that case, why not fewer diseases? Why not less pain needed to achieve? Whatever goods exist, why the distribution of misery we actually see, scattered apparently at random across the innocent and the guilty, the careful and the careless alike? The defender of providence may respond by denying the extent of human misery. Perhaps things are not as bad as the pessimist claims. Perhaps taken on the whole, happiness outweighs suffering. Hume is willing, for the sake of argument, to grant this. Suppose that, on balance, there is more pleasure than pain in human life. What follows about the character of the universe's cause? At most, he argues, we could infer that the cause is not opposed to our happiness. If a being allows both joy and grief, both flourishing and devastation, this is consistent with many different moral characters. A deity who is mildly benevolent, but indifferent to countless preventable harms. A being whose primary concern lies elsewhere, beauty, complexity, regularity, while the well-being of individual creatures is a side effect at best. Once again, the analogy with human minds begins to strain. Hume sharpens the point by considering several broad hypotheses. Suppose first that the cause of the universe is perfectly good in a sense that aligns with our own moral ideals. Given the scope and intensity of suffering, this is not the most natural reading of the data. Suppose instead that the cause is perfectly evil. This is equally implausible, since there are also obvious goods, love, beauty, joy, ordinary contentment. A third option is that the cause is a mixture of good and evil motives engaged in some grand inner struggle. That picture fits our mythology more than our observations. The fourth option is that the cause of the universe is morally indifferent. It operates according to principles that are not guided by concern for happiness or misery as such. The world displays stable laws and regularities, gravity, biological reproduction, the chemistry of fire, the fragility of bodies. These laws generate both good and bad outcomes for us without obvious favoritism. Crops grow under the same sun that burns. Rivers irrigate fields and drown villages. Our own psychological capacities give rise to kindness and cruelty from the same roots. On this picture, neither pleasure nor pain is primary. They are byproducts of a system that is, in itself, beyond our moral categories. We may call this divine indifference, though Hume would be cautious with the term divine. The point is not an argument for a cold deity in particular, but a reminder that the data of experience do not single out a loving, human like God as their clear cause. The problem is sharper when we consider moral evil, the harm we do to one another. If we insist that every effect must be traced back to a first cause, and that this first cause is a personal God, we seem to place even human wrongdoing within a divine plan. Our cruelty, negligence, and malice become, in some way, part of a design. The more tightly we attribute all causation to God, the more directly we implicate God in the existence of vice. One response is to fall back on mystery. We say that God's ways are not our ways, that divine goodness is beyond human comprehension, that what appears as evil to us is part of a pattern we cannot see. Hume has already prepared an answer to this retreat. If we make God's goodness so unlike our own that we cannot recognize it in the world, then the word good loses its familiar meaning. We are no longer talking about anything we understand by kindness, justice, or mercy. The appeal to mystery empties the claim of content without resolving the tension. This returns us to his earlier dilemma. If we insist that God is morally similar to us, then the state of the world counts as serious evidence against perfect benevolence. If we insist that God is morally dissimilar, we may preserve belief by insulating it from observation, but we can no longer say coherently what we are affirming. Goodness becomes a sound for an unknown attribute, not a recognizable quality. For Hume, the conclusion is not that life is meaningless, or that feeling outrage at injustice is mistaken. On the contrary, he roots morality in human sentiment. Our responses of approval and disapproval, our sympathy with others, our sense of what harms or helps flourishing creatures, these are grounded in impression and experience. The problem of evil touches not on whether we should care about suffering, but on whether we can legitimately project a human-like care onto the ultimate cause of the universe. When we look steadily at the mixed and confused phenomena of life, Hume suggests we do not see the clear imprint of perfect goodness. We see instead a world rolling along under general laws, indifferent to individual fates, generating complex patterns of joy and pain. To insist that this pattern is the work of an infinitely kind will is to go beyond what observation supports. At best, we may say that nothing here conclusively rules out such a will. But absence of disproof is far from a positive case. Divine indifference, in this sense, is less a dogma than a limit. It marks the point at which attempts to read a moral narrative into nature becomes speculative. We may still, for personal or communal reasons, take the world as meaningful as the arena of a benevolent purpose. But Hume reminds us that such faith does not arise from a clear, logical inference from suffering to love. It is, if it exists, a commitment of the heart, not a conclusion of natural science. Seen in this light, the problem of evil does not merely challenge one argument for God. It further erodes the promise of natural theology. If we cannot tell, from the face of the world, whether its cause is good, evil, mixed, or indifferent, then the supposed path from observation to a richly characterized deity is broken. We may still be left with a vague sense of some originating principle. We do not, however, arrive by reason at the God of common devotion, all-knowing, all-powerful, and wholly good. In the background, Hume's broader project continues. He is not only testing religious claims. He is showing how our minds strain when they try to lift themselves beyond their proper reach. We long to see suffering folded into a comforting design. We long to be assured that the universe is, at bottom, on our side. His philosophy does not remove that longing. It simply refuses to mistake it for knowledge. Beyond the details of specific arguments, Hume is gradually telling a larger story. Natural theology begins with confidence. It promises to show, by reason alone, that there is a God, and to describe this God's attributes: powerful, wise, good, perhaps infinite. The materials of the world we experience and the principles of thought. The goal is an orderly map of the divine, drawn without appeal to revelation. By the time we reach the end of the inquiry, this project looks very different. Nothing has been refuted in a dramatic, decisive way. Instead, under Hume's quiet pressure, the structure has thinned and blurred. What remains is less an edifice than a mist. This is what it means to speak of the dissolution of natural theology. Consider how the erosion happens. First, the copy principle asks us to test our ideas against experience. Do we have clear impressions corresponding to infinite power, infinite wisdom, necessary existence? Often we find only modified versions of human traits, inflated by imagination and labelled. Without limit, our words begin to outrun what we can actually picture or feel. Next, the analogy at the heart of the design argument is examined. We infer a designer by comparing the world to human artifacts. But the universe is not a watch or a house. It is unique in our experience. We have never seen another world constructed, improved, or repaired. We know too little of too small a portion of reality over too short a time to make secure inferences about its ultimate cause. The comparison to craftsmanship, which once felt so intuitive, now looks thin. Then comes the pressure from evil and suffering. If we cling to the image of a God whose goodness resembles ours, the world does not easily fit that image. If we protect divine goodness by making it utterly unlike our own, we hollow out the content of our claims. The very terms goodness, justice, mercy no longer mean what they mean in our lives. They become, as Hume warns, sounds without clear ideas. At this stage, natural theology might attempt a retreat. Perhaps it says we should scale back our ambitions. Let us not claim to know that God is infinitely perfect. Let us infer only that there is some intelligent cause, some ordering principle faintly analogous to human mind. We will leave aside grand assertions about moral character and focus on a thin, cautious conclusion. Hume's final move is to show what this retreat really costs. If the cause of the universe is only vaguely like a human mind, in some remote and undefined respect, then the word God has been drained of its traditional content. Anything can be said to resemble anything else at some level of abstraction. A rotting vegetable, the growth of an animal, the flow of thoughts in our heads, all may probably bear some analogy to each other. This does not tell us much. When the degree and nature of the supposed resemblance cannot be fixed, the resulting proposition admits of no precise meaning. It cannot be clearly affirmed or denied. We may nod along, saying that nature looks, if it were designed, but the as-if does almost all the work. The inference to an actual designer becomes, in Hume's image, an ambiguous, at least undefined, claim. It is compatible with almost any underlying reality. This is what makes the dispute between theist and skeptic, as he presents it, worse than a mere verbal quarrel. In ordinary verbal disputes, we can often resolve confusion by defining our terms. Here, the very attempt to define the key terms, God, perfection, goodness, wisdom, leads us back into the earlier dilemmas. If we define them in ways that tie them closely to human qualities. We make bold claims that conflict with observation. If we define them in ways that insist on total transcendence, we disconnect them from experience entirely. The result is not that one side decisively wins. It is that the battlefield itself fades. The core questions of natural theology, what is God like and how do we know, lose their clear shape. We are left, at best, with a hazy affirmation that there is some ultimate principle behind the world, bearing a distant relationship to intelligence. Hume is willing to concede even this, insofar as it makes no assertive claim about the principle's character. But the victory, from the point of view of traditional religion, is hollow. This is why, in his other writings, Hume speaks of how easily the idea of God can be augmented without limit, and how dangerous this is for clarity. Each time we add another layer, more power, more knowledge, more perfection, we seem to grow in reverence. Yet each step takes us further from any clear impression. Eventually our concept becomes so expanded that it can no longer be traced back to the experiential materials from which it began. The dissolution of natural theology, then, is not the loud collapse of a proud system. It is the quiet realization that the system has been built from materials too thin to support its weight. The foundations are impressions of mind. Order, value are limited and human. The structure erected upon them, an infinite, morally perfect creator, described in detail, is more ambitious than they can bear. What remains after this process is not necessarily unbelief. People may still find themselves moved by religious practices, attached to inherited forms of life, or comforted by images of providence. Hume does not, and perhaps could not, abolish these. His point is narrower reason, observing nature and reflecting on its own capacities, cannot justify strong claims about the divine nature. Whatever religion may be, it is not a body of doctrines securely inferred from the study of the world. In this sense, his conclusion folds back into the opening of his philosophy, the science of human nature, he proposes, teaches us not only about impressions and ideas, about custom and belief, but about the limits of speculative thought. When we push beyond what experience supplies, our words begin to float. They may guide feeling or action, but they no longer report clear knowledge. We are left, finally, in a more modest position. The universe appears ordered in ways we can partially grasp. Life contains good and ill in measures we struggle to weigh. Our minds, driven by habit and hope, spontaneously form images of purposes behind it all. Hume asks us to distinguish this natural tendency from a justified conclusion. Natural theology, as a claim to know the mind and heart of the ultimate cause, dissolves under that scrutiny. What does not dissolve is the project of understanding ourselves. We can still examine how we come to form such vast ideas, why they attract us, and how they shape our lives. In doing so, we trade the promise of knowing the infinite for the quieter, but more secure, work of knowing the finite mind that longs for it.